We started. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Soul Things. I'm your host, Brenna Koss, and I'm so excited for this conversation that we are having today with Jesse Eubanks from Love Thy Neighborhood, which is an incredible organization. So thank you for being on the show, Jesse.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So for my audience that doesn't know about you or your organization, could you sort of take a moment to explain who you are and what Love Thy Neighborhood is?
Sure. Yeah. So I lead an organization called Love Thy Neighborhood, and we essentially do two things. So we do missions and we do discipleship. So on the mission side, I say we are like the Peace Corps with Bibles. So we
Mm,
recruit young adults from all over the world. They relocate to our city. So we're based out of Louisville, Kentucky, and they spend either a summer or a year partnering with nonprofits all over the city. So about 25 hours a week of service. About 15 hours a week is invested into their own personal growth.
mm,
So they're doing an hour of silence and solitude every morning. They live in community. They're reading curriculum, and then another 15 hours is just devoted to the life of their neighborhood, the life of their community. And so those folks come in, young adults 18 to 30, and serve with us. And then on the other side, we just do all things discipleship.
mm.
So we have a couple of podcasts. We have a workbook. I've got a book coming out early next year. And so we do workshops. So lots and lots of things just to help people follow Jesus faithfully and hopefully also learn how to be good at relationships. That's kind of our other thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. One of the ways that I found you guys was through your podcast, actually. I know you have a couple now. So do you want to share a little bit about what your two podcasts are?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So one of our podcasts is called Love Thy Neighborhood. And I say if you baptized NPR, you would get our show. So the Love Thy Neighborhood podcast is narrative journalism. So we go out and we get real stories of Christians trying to follow Jesus in modern culture. And we tackle easy subjects like racial reconciliation and gender dysphoria and
Yeah.
abortion and like all these like very simple things. And so but we just cover a ton of different topics, and but at its heart, it's really a storytelling podcast. We really want to step
Mm,
inside the experiences of people. So we have a couple of staff members. They work full time on the show, and so when you're listening, it's immersive and has a lot of sound design, and yeah, so it's a lot of fun. So that's the Love That Neighborhood podcast. The other one is called the Enneacast. And that is a show that explores the Enneagram, which is a personality tool, and we explore it from the perspective of through a gospel lens. So, what is the intersection of personality and faith,
mm,
and how does personality shape the way that I relate to God and everybody else? And how do I work on this discipline, this spiritual discipline of self-awareness,
mhm,
which can be really hard. And so yeah, so that one's a fun one. We teach. So like the first portion is like a sort of like a workshop, like we teach, and then we
mhm.
have guests come on that we interview, and then after we get really deep and like often kind of emotional, then we go and we play stupid games at the end of the show and goof off. And
I
it's
love
sort of
that.
it's sort of like Jimmy Fallon games and stuff. It's very, very silly and fun.
Yeah, it's a good balance. I love that podcast. I've been listening to it for the past like 2 weeks straight. And one of the ways that you tackle certain episodes is talking about how each type handles conflict. And that's something that I've been super interested in lately. I'm a 3 on the Enneagram. So I think you're a 3 too, right? Is that what I heard
I'm
from the
I'm a
podcast?
four wing. I'm a four wing three, and my 4 and my 3
Okay.
duke it out all the time. So yeah.
Yeah, I love a good to-do list. So,
Hmm.
but yeah, when it comes to conflict, that's sort of the topic that I wanted to tackle today as our hard space on the show. Just because I feel like at any age, there's going to be conflict, right? But specifically with young adults or life in your 20s, whether you're married or living with roommates, conflict is going to arise. And like, how do we figure out how to do that well, whether it's through understanding ourselves or understanding that other person's type, or just understanding our relationship with God, all these different factors that come into play. So I'd love to sort of just kind of tackle that subject today, because I know this is something that everybody deals with at some point. And on your show, you even have a whole episode. I think it's like the second or third episode you guys do on Love Thy Neighborhood about community and some conflict stories. So I'll link that in the description, because you guys have to listen to that. They're really powerful stories about how our backgrounds can sort of shape how we handle those things. And I know I've definitely experienced that firsthand. So let's kind of dive into this hard-hitting topic of conflict. Are you ready, Jesse?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Are we gonna fight?
I think we should do a scenario. We should act it out.
Good.
We'll keep the peace. We'll keep the peace for this hour. All right. So obviously with your program, you're dealing with a lot of young adults. And just like I said a few moments ago, conflict arises with working in tight corners in community and even through ministry. So how have you seen conflict sort of play out in your program and with students? And how do you sort of manage that?
Yeah. So when people come in to be a part of Love Thy Neighborhood, when young adults do, a lot of people come in primarily from the perspective they want to serve people in need. Like that's kind of the biggest drive. But often at the very end, when we say like, what was the most meaningful part of the experience, it was living in community. But then when we also say what was the hardest experience, they say living in community.
Mm-hmm.
And that shouldn't be surprising. Like all of life is about relationships. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's, when Jesus talks about love God, love other people as you love yourself, like that's relationships. And
Right.
so we see, young adults struggle with conflict for a ton of different reasons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, there's definitely like there's personality stuff. So like some of us are cool with conflict. We're like fine with it. It's like conflict comes and we're like, all right, roll up your sleeves, like
Mm-hmm.
let's go. And others of us, conflict comes and it feels so threatening, like it's
Mm-hmm.
gonna overwhelm us. It feels like, if I voice my real opinion, this relationship is gonna break. I'm gonna
Mm-hmm.
lose this friend. I'm gonna lose this boyfriend or girlfriend. Like
Mm-hmm.
this sense in which it's just very, very consuming. Some of that, comes with like, when I think about like young adults stepping into conflict too, the reality is like, folks that are in their 20s, like by and large, you're working with the tools that were provided to you by your family of origin.
Yep.
And your family of origin, in some cases, had very limited tools, and in some cases, had a ton of tools,
Mm-hmm.
but no family had all the tools.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you are thrown into these, petri dish situations, you're living in an apartment with two other people, and their way of handling life is so different than yours. Like it's just inevitable that you're going to end up arguing. So we, in our context, yeah, people argue about everything. I mean, literally everything.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like the dishes to dinner to theology to expectations. I mean, it's all the things. And I think the thing that makes it particularly hard when you're in your 20s in a lot of ways is um your 20s is where you are really learning, these are the skills I have,
Mm-hmm.
but you're also starting to see these are the skills I don't have, but I also have not yet developed things to replace those.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it can kind of feel like the tool belt's a little limited, but you're being thrust into this whole adulting scenario, and it can be tough.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'm learning about conflict, just with either like living with roommates or like dealing with family or just coworkers, different things like that, is trying to shape my perspective on what conflict is, in the sense that this is an opportunity for me to learn about myself, to learn about this other person, and to grow, versus like, because I was sort of like that one example you were saying of like, oh my gosh, this relationship's in jeopardy because I don't know how to like move past this. And this means that like something's unhealthy and it's going to break, versus like, this is an opportunity to grow. So I think that shift in perspective of what conflict can be an opportunity versus like a threat is something that I'm saying, and I'm still working through, but I think it's definitely a challenge because, like you said, you're maturing a lot. Like you can either choose to, go back to maybe like, oh, I'm going to handle this like a high schooler, or like how I would as a kid and revert back to my family of origin, or I can choose to like step into the uncomfortable and like try to grow. But I don't like being in uncomfortable space. I mean, nobody does. Nobody likes being in those uncomfortable spaces. So stepping into those is like really challenging. Were there any times when you were in your 20s where there was like a specific conflict that maybe stood out to you and you look back and you're like, wow, I really grew a lot from that instance? I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here.
Yeah,
um,
no. I think
yeah.
about, I was in a similar situation that you're in. You work for a nonprofit,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to take it's a ministry as well. Like it's a
Yes.
nonprofit ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So very similar situation to me. And, here's the dark but truth. Like it's dark but true. We would
Mm-hmm.
spend all of our days telling people about how awesome Jesus was and how much he loved
Mm-hmm.
them. And then behind the scenes, we were all like bickering with each other,
Yep.
and in a lot of ways, looking back, I think there were a lot of times where I made things worse, where I just didn't know better.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to be gracious to my younger self. Like I just didn't know better. So
Yeah.
I would say things that would, make situations worse, or there would be scenarios where like I needed to have spoken up and I didn't. I
Mm-hmm.
kept it to myself, or I wasn't very
Mm-hmm.
tactful. I mean, there's a million, you know, scenarios, but when you take especially like the intensity of the 20s, and then you're mixing in like your idealism, like we're going to be the generation that's going to change the world,
Right.
and then like the world just freaking refuses to change. It's
Yes.
like
Yeah.
it's just utterly igniting as a person. And so there were just a lot of scenarios in my work context for sure. And then also like I got married in my mid-20s, and
Yeah.
that was like my poor wife.
Aw.
I just had like no sense of like, I don't know. I just thought she needed my opinion on everything. It was like
I bet she
ridiculous.
loved that.
It was ridiculous. And so like, yeah. So like, yeah. I mean, there's no shortage. Yeah. My
Yeah.
my my 20s were pretty laced with conflict. Yeah.
In those moments of conflict at work or in a marriage, like what were the tools? Like what helped you grow in those conflicts? I know like it probably wasn't perfect resolution every single time, but what were some key things that really kind of helped you come out the other side more mature, more Christ-like?
Yeah, I think on the one hand, I think that I was able to sort of get a better grasp on some bad theology that I had. So like,
Mm.
in particular, the like, don't let the sun go down on your anger, and it's like we have to fix this tonight. And well, it's
Yeah.
like, well, no, half the time, like going and sleeping literally does resolve it, because sometimes it's just like I'm exhausted, I'm overwhelmed, and if I would
Mm-hmm.
just get some rest, I would actually have wisdom and perspective that I cannot access when I'm all worked up or exhausted. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think some
Mm-hmm.
of that is more like take your anger to the Lord and
Mm.
trust that all you need to do is the next right thing, to
Yeah.
use Emily P. Freeman's phrase. And and sometimes that literally means like go eat a sandwich and take a nap, and
Yeah.
then come back and let's see how we're doing. I think
Mm-hmm.
the other thing is the other thing too is I really did learn like I don't need to share my thoughts on everything. Um
Mm.
and and A lot of relationships, like if you imagine that there's a bridge between you and other people,
Mm-hmm.
our fear is that when conflict comes up, that the bridge can't handle the load, and that
Mm.
it's too heavy, the bridge is going to break.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I did come to realize, like, you know what, a lot of my relationships have a lot more strength than I give them credit for.
Yeah.
And in fact, like, there was some, I wish I could tell you who the research was from, but there was some research that came out a few years ago that
Mm-hmm.
showed that in relationships when there's no conflict,
Mm-hmm.
or when there's conflict and then there is people making amends and reconnecting, working through things, that those people actually have much stronger relationships than the people that never had any conflict at all.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so yeah, so I think those things. And then the final thing I would say is you know, I got into the Enneagram because I was out of tools.
Hmm.
Like you know, my coworkers in ministry, like we tried it all. We were out of tools. My wife and I were in a tough season of marriage. We had said all the words that we knew to say. We
Hmm.
had looked at it from all the perspectives that our limited way of looking allowed.
Hmm.
And so the Enneagram allowed me to empathize with other people's
Hmm.
points of view
Hmm.
and gave us new language to talk about things.
Yeah.
So like it turns out people are not doing things to make it personal and just to drive me crazy. It's like they're genuinely living out of the way that they perceive reality and the way that
Yeah.
and I'm living out of the same. And the truth is that both of us are right and both of us are wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. The Enneagram, I had a similar experience too. I came across the Enneagram in college, I want to say. And I think there was just this, just a lot of conflicts happening with my roommate at the time in college. I think we were like in sophomore year, and we had been best friends freshman year. Like we were experiencing all this new life together, and we were like, we weren't roommates at the time. We were just living on the same floor, and we just did everything together besides living together. And so we're like, this will be great. We're going to move in together next year. And it was the worst experience of
Mm.
my life with her. And we had so much conflict. And we, that same year, I had found the Enneagram. Kind of toward the end of that year, and started learning more about how like I respond to things, how I function, how I manage stress and homework and life and dealing with family things and vice versa. And we just like didn't, kind of like what you're saying, we didn't have the language or the understanding to be able to understand ourselves, to step into conflict in a healthy way.
Yeah.
um and through God's grace, we're able to like work through stuff, the latter half of college, but yeah, it's one of those things where the Enneagram really did sort of help me understand. And even just listening to your podcast about the Enneagram 3 and like how to manage conflict, there was something that I forget her name, you had a guest on, and she was talking about her husband was an 8 and she was a 3, and how they sort of handled
Oh
arguments.
yeah. Sharon McMahon. Sharon says so. Yeah.
Yes, Sharon says so. I related to her so strongly on so many things. So even just the feeling of not feeling alone in how I handle conflict made me like put me at ease a little bit of like, okay,
Yeah.
like I know that like these two bulls are butting heads. So maybe we just need to take a space for a second and like reconnect, eat a sandwich, like all these things that you're saying. So the Enneagram has definitely helped me as well. So I can totally relate to that. And just having, the language and the understanding. Have you found, I'm just curious, have you found through even doing this podcast, like new ways to manage conflict for yourself and stuff?
Oh yeah, for sure. Like it's I mean, honestly, I think the longer that I spend time exploring the Enneagram, it's sort of a black hole. It's like you can go just
Yeah.
really, really down into the depths. And I think the longer that, I spend time in it, and my co-host Lindsay Lewis, we talk about this, like there's a real sense in which you're like, dude, I'm really, really broken. Like in
Mm,
the like, I use the analogy of like if you've ever put away Christmas lights too fast and they're just this bundle mess, and then the next year you're like, how am I supposed to like undo these? Like at some point you just throw it in the trash and go buy new ones. Like
mhm.
my soul just feels like a bundle
Yeah.
of Christmas lights. It's like
Ugh.
there's beauty and like plug it in, it's pretty, but it's also like a
Mhm.
total disaster at the same time. And
Yeah.
so I think that yes, for sure, like exploring that, exploring the Enneagram, yes, I see more of my brokenness. But I think that
Mm,
the biggest thing in terms of conflict is it really is like the ability to empathize with other people more.
mm,
I'm not always great at empathy, like,
mhm,
which is kind of strange because I'm a type 4, which is supposed to be like our
mhm,
superpower. I'm not that like, and that's my
mm,
childhood stuff. Like that's my own
mhm.
trauma from my own life.
Yeah.
But but it has helped me to be able to pause and go, well, from their perspective,
Mhm,
they're probably experiencing this moment in the following ways, and that
mhm.
alone allows me sometimes just not to come in with guns blazing or to be
Yeah.
passive. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true. That's a great point. One of the questions I've been thinking about a little bit is this idea of keeping the peace and like being a peacemaker. So I'm going through this book right now called emotionally healthy spirituality, and just kind of working through what does it look like to become more of an emotionally healthy adult, because you can, get older and you're still acting like you're, in high school age. So it's like a choice you have to make. So what are the tools? And so I've been reading through this book, and there's a section in the book about conflict, and they talk about false peacemaking and true peacemaking, because a lot of times they talk about in the Bible how we misinterpret Matthew 5:9 that says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." And so for me, when a lot of times they were saying that Christians will read that and be like, all right, I don't want to upset the peace. I'm not going to say anything that's going to unsettle the waters. I'm going to ignore hard conversations. I'm just going to shove it down, and I'm just going to, coast through, because that's what the Bible says to do, right? It's keep the peace. But what have you learned through conflict about what is like true peacemaking and what is false peacemaking when it comes to conflict?
Yeah. What a great question. Here's false peacemaking centers around the idea of appeasement.
Mm,
I'm going to tell you what you want to hear, regardless of whether that is authentic to my own convictions. And I'm going to tell it because I don't trust that our relationship can handle the truth.
yeah.
And so appeasement is not the same as reconciliation. Appeasement is not
Mm,
the same as peace. It's placating, it's a pacifier.
mm-hmm.
I'm doing what I got to do to make you shut up and be easygoing. And that's very different. Like we look at the life of Jesus, and you cannot read the gospel without seeing somebody who was willing. And I wouldn't say comfortable is not the right word, but let's just say, well, he was willing to step into conflict on a routine basis because he believed that there are scenarios in which the only way to get to true peace is
Mm,
through conflict. So it's for the joy set before him that he endured the cross.
mm.
And
It's good.
so often, um, you know, we just tend to, I don't know, in life, like we just tend to take something and we tend to like make it like the big point. So,
Yeah.
if you say like, well, Jesus is okay with conflict, he flipped the tables. Well, yes, that did happen. But if you're
Mhm.
flipping tables all the time, I
Yeah.
don't think that that's reflective of Jesus. And I think in the same way, like Jesus does say, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and
Right.
he was saying that to a people that were tempted to join a revolution to violently overthrow Rome. Like
Mm-hmm.
and so there's a sense in which I think anytime that we take one thing, whatever that thing is, and we
Mm-hmm.
make it bigger and more important than everything else, I think that we're getting into like an addiction to our way
Mm-hmm.
of doing things instead
Mm-hmm.
of actually trying to walk with Jesus.
Yeah, that's so good. And it's like this cherry picking almost of the instances of Jesus versus looking at his life in the context of his entire ministry.
Right.
Because another verse that I was looking into is Matthew 10, where he's like, do you not think that I've come to bring peace to the earth? I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. And then he talks about the
Right.
division within families. And so people could take that out of context, or they could take the other verse out of context.
Yep.
And it's like, how do we look at the instances of Jesus's life and how he lived holistically? Because one of the things I love that your podcast continually brings up is this balance of grace and truth amidst these really hard topics. So when it comes to looking at the life of Jesus and like how he balanced that, how do you see like the way that Jesus lived his life in the context of conflict, showing grace and truth at the same time to get to that true peace that we're trying to talk about here?
Yeah, I think one of the things is that our most recent episode of the Love the Neighborhood podcast is actually called Where the Gospel Meets Conflict, and
Oh.
it's literally us exploring this topic. And one of the things that we explore in the episode is that in the span of a single chapter in one of the Gospels, we see Jesus respond to conflict and threats in three entirely different ways. And the
Hmm.
lesson there is that there's not a one size fits all way to respond to conflict.
Mm-hmm.
There's only an intention and a heart behind the way that you're approaching the conflict.
Yeah.
So there are scenarios where Jesus confronts, there are scenarios where he flees, there are scenarios where he says nothing, there are scenarios where like he is a boss and like puts everybody in their place. Like there's so many different ways. And I think that there's a real sense in which Jesus avoided being addicted to one of those ways. And
Mm,
he applied the exact response that that person needed at that moment. And that takes like a real attunement to the Lord that is
mm,
very difficult for the rest of us to hold on to.
yeah.
It's almost as if like we sort of we're like in the swimming pool and our head comes up and we get this one moment of fresh air and then we get submerged again. It's like it's very hard for us to stay afloat and stay attuned to the Lord and not just get into our fixations.
Yeah. I feel like the times that I handle conflict the best or I'm just at most peace is when I'm spending really like intimate times with the Father and like in his like being in his presence and being like really intentional about those moments to like allow the Spirit to like guide me and into like those hard spaces. So I totally like understand what you're saying. So how would you describe so say like somebody's in a conflict, how would you describe, okay, now we're actually getting to this true peacemaking aspect? I think we've talked a little bit about, the issues of false peacemaking, but how would you sort of describe the path to getting to true peacemaking? What does that look like?
Yeah, the path to true peacemaking. So spoiler. So if you listen to our episode on conflict, we talk about this in the episode, but
Mm,
I'll give you a sneak peek.
nice.
The We explore the story of this guy that was asked to come in to moderate debates on some of the biggest topics that are taking place within Christendom right now.
Hmm.
So they do racial reconciliation, they do gun control. So it's like these big issues, and he he recommends approaching conflicts with what he calls the 3 C's. So the
Mm,
3 C's are: first is comprehend. So the first thing is this: do I fully and truly understand what you're trying to communicate to me?
hmm,
And can I say it back to you in a satisfactory way? So can I go, Brenna, what I hear you saying is X, Y, and Z. And it seems like what you're trying to tell me is X, Y, and Z.
mm-hmm,
And it seems like you're upset because of X, Y, Z.
mm-hmm,
Does all that seem true? And if you
mm,
go, yes, okay, so I have comprehended. I don't have to
mm,
agree. I'm not agreeing.
mm,
I'm just saying, am I hearing what you're saying?
mm,
The second thing is commend.
mm,
So Brent, I love your heart behind what you're saying.
mm,
I love the fact that you want a deep relationship, or I love the fact that you're trying to fix, this situation the rest of us are tempted to ignore, or I love the passion that you're, whatever it is, but I
mm,
commend. And then the very last step is, and now I'm going to offer some critique.
mm,
But now that you feel okay, they've heard me. Okay, they have affirmed that some of the things that I've said, but now they're offering their critique.
mm.
The problem is, it's so often we jump straight to critique.
Yep.
Last night,
Mm-hmm.
my wife and I made the idiotic decision to have a loaded conversation at 11:30 at night.
Oh,
I can
no.
guarantee we did not do comprehend or commend and went pretty fast into critique. So like, so I think that generally following that is a great way. And I think even like, let me do, here's an example that's like not quite as personal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the best debaters, when they summarize the opponent's
Mm-hmm.
camp, I'm saying opponent with quote marks, when they summarize, they never insert words that their opponent would not use themselves, and they never
Hmm.
summarize their point of view in ways that are not true to that person's way of seeing.
Oh,
So
wow.
you always start off with, so this other person believes X, Y, Z, and you don't manipulate it. Now, we see in political debates that's not what happens. They
Right.
twist and the turn. But the people that are really the best thought leaders, those people give, you know, they're never going to summarize in a way that's unfair, or the other side would not say themselves. And I think
Yeah.
that's a lesson for us interpersonally. Don't summarize someone else in
Yeah.
a way that they themselves would not.
Yeah. Yeah. And it kind of goes back to that understanding aspect too that you're talking about.
Right.
I
Yeah.
love that breakdown. I found that super helpful. One of the things I want to tackle when it comes to conflict is I've been in conflict specifically with a couple of my friends that aren't believers. And so for me, and the goal of my life to bring honor and glory to the Lord in every aspect, and like wanting to think through these things of conflict, they're not necessarily doing the same thing. So I've come into situations and points of conflict where I feel like I'm doing everything I can to try to handle this well. And there's still like an issue or pushback. So what would you say to somebody maybe who's like maybe in conflict now or has in the past, where you feel like you're trying to do the best that you can with all these tools that we've been talking about and these steps, but it just doesn't seem to be like be received well or respond well or reciprocated, whether that person's a believer or not? It's just in my instance, they're
Yeah.
not. What encouragement would you say or guidance would you say to that person who's struggling with that?
Yeah, yeah. That's a tough one, because there are, you know, gosh, I think that one of the journeys for people in their 20s, and it's a really painful one, is
Mm-hmm.
some things aren't going to change. And that's
Mm-hmm.
so much of the 20s is like this battle between idealism and realism,
Yeah.
and this sense in which like older people are settling when they shouldn't be settling. They should be fighting and pushing for what's good and
Mm-hmm.
true. And then older people are kind of like, hey, youngins, like you guys have to like accept a few things. And it's just such, I just have such empathy for you guys in the stage of life you're in, because it's a real struggle. Like, I want these relationships to be great. I'm trying everything I know. I can see in my mind's eye how it
Mm-hmm.
could be, but we just can't get there. And the
Yeah.
truth is, like, it is very possible some of the people you're trying to work with, like, they they can't. It's
Mm-hmm.
going to be another decade before things really start to shift inside of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there are scenarios, I mean, as we have well seen in the last few years, like Christians are capable of horrible conflict, just as much as
Mm-hmm.
anybody else. Like
Yeah.
we, um, human beings, there are times where we just have to accept the pace of life,
Mm.
and that sometimes change is a very slow process.
Yeah.
And there are moments in which we have to be willing just to sit in the grace of God and just go, Lord, I'm going to do everything I can. But the truth is, I can't fix this.
Yeah.
You can, and you've told me that you will complete every good thing you've started, and I have to
Mm-hmm.
entrust this to you. In some cases, that means you're absorbing a lot of the debt. So the other person's just, they're hacked off all the time, and you're being
Mm-hmm.
kind and loving. And
Mm-hmm.
it's really actually not even about you. It's about other stuff in life, and you're just absorbing it.
Yeah.
And then there are other times, where you got to like step it up and get in the ring and
Yeah.
go for it. And,
Yeah.
and, and those are, it's just hard. It's just hard.
Yeah.
Sometimes,
And
sometimes
that,
change
yeah.
just doesn't come.
Yeah, that's so refreshing to hear because I just feel like we live in a world where the word toxic is thrown around a lot. And when
Yeah.
conflict like that happens and nothing's changing, oh, well, that person's just toxic and I'm going to cut him out of my life. And I don't, cancel culture, all these sort of like things that lack patience and understanding and these things that emulate Christ.
Yeah.
Can sort of be lacking in conflict when, especially with one of those people isn't actively seeking the Lord or doesn't know him at all.
Yeah.
So it's like trying to find that balance of how long do I put up with this this person in conflict until it's like, I don't know, like is this person, should this person stay in my life or should I still wrestle with the Lord? So these are things that in my life right now I'm dealing with for sure.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like one of the phrases we use at LTN is we say fight toward each other, not
Mm-hmm.
against each other. And
That's good.
I think that when you're in your 20s and you get that sense, like not in a single interaction, but over thematically in that relationship, do
Mm-hmm.
you sense that other person, even in their brokenness,
Mm-hmm.
that they genuinely are they're trying to fight towards you? It's jacked
Mm.
up, it's wrong, it's
That's
all over
good.
the place, but they're
Mm-hmm.
trying with what they've
Mm-hmm.
got. And are you doing the same? Okay, well, that's a pretty hopeful dynamic, and
Mm-hmm.
that's different than, because I do think there are times where there are certain relationships that we do need to release completely. We need to let them
Mm-hmm.
go. We need to move on and trust that, it's like the rich young ruler. Like there are times where it's just like, I'm not going to chase you. I'm not going to follow you. I'm going to release
Mm-hmm.
you. And,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think there are times for that, but I agree with you that I think the real risk is if we cut out everybody that we just say, well, I just don't like how they make me feel all the time, or I don't, that we're cutting out all the conflict. But like conflict, man, conflict is good for us. Like every story that we love requires conflict. I remember when my daughter is 14, but she draws graphic novels. She's like 700 pages into this graphic novel that she's creating. And I remember when she was like 6, something silly happened on like a cartoon, and my younger son, he just goes, "Why'd that happen? That didn't make any sense." And my daughter goes, "Because without conflict, there's no story."
Oof.
And I think like we at a certain level know that every story that we love, movie, book, has to have conflict, because conflict is how we change as people.
That's good.
And we remove everyone from our life that brings any level of conflict. We are committing to never change. And
Wow.
that's a very dangerous position to be in.
Yeah. Wow. That's really powerful to think about. I've never thought of it that way. Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so one of the things I've been thinking about too is conflict in the context of dating relationships. I'm currently in a dating relationship, and like some of my friends are, so we're kind of like in similar stages. And I think there's this element of navigating, like, okay, I'm getting to know this person, like things are going well, and then like conflict happens, and you're like, okay, is this okay? Is this a bad sign that this person is quote unquote toxic, or this isn't somebody that I should be spending the rest of my life with? Like, you're kind of thinking about it differently than you would a friendship or a family conflict or roommates. So kind of what advice would you give to people who are kind of in the dating scene and dealing with conflict right now?
Yeah, I think that there's a level where you have to know some of your own boundaries in terms of the kind of conflict that works for you. So like Lindsay Lewis, who's my co-host on the Enneacast, she talks about, because of dynamics in her youth, she was very clear, like she wanted to marry somebody that in conflict would never raise their voice and yell at her. That was a boundary she needed. So I think there's a sense in which there are times where you have to kind of know a few things that are like, those are deal breakers for me. Like, now you put in too many deal breakers, you're going to be single the rest of your life.
Yeah.
So like, there's a sense, but at the same time, I also think, I think a lot of times our friends see things that we can't, like our healthy friends, like,
Yeah.
I've been in relationships in the past. My wife was in relationships in the past. And in both cases, if we had just listened to our friends would have been able to say, hey, the way that person just treated you in the midst of that conflict is not okay. And as your friends, we are not on board with that.
Yeah.
I also think that the ability for the person to reconcile, and here's what I don't mean. They act horrible. I'm sorry, I cry. And then a week later, they do the exact same behavior again. That is not real repentance. Now, we're not asking for perfection. That's unfair. But a person that's like, I just behaved in a way that was really detrimental to you.
Yeah.
Then that person goes to their friends and confesses it to them and says, this is what happened. I don't want to treat her like this. I want to be better than this. I need to work on the issues that are causing me to behave this way. Okay, that's real repentance. So fake repentance is I'm boohooing and telling you I'm so sorry, but I'm really not doing any personal work to change. That's no bueno. Yeah.
Yeah. When there's no actual like action to back up the words, then why saying it? I think mediation or mediating conflict is something that I find kind of interesting. And there was an element of the episode that I listened to where you were sort of mediating in a way of hearing the conflict that had happened among those girls during the incident. So what role do you think mediation plays in conflict? Do you think when is it necessary? How often have you done it? Like, what are your thoughts on mediating conflict?
Yeah, I love the fact that you're like, the incident. And that's literally what we all call it, is we refer to it as the incident, because it was pretty substantial.
Yeah.
So, okay, wait, ask your question again, because I got so entertained
No,
by you calling it that.
just what place do you think mediation has in conflict? Like, when do you get to a point where like, all right, we need to bring a third party into this or somebody to hear this out? Is it just in the context of a program, or is it like,
No.
when you're with roommates, we need to bring in another person? Like, when do you
Yes.
bring in mediation,
Yeah. I think that anytime that you find that you've had that same conversation 5 times, a dozen times, 100 times,
Mm-hmm.
and you're both using the same language, but you can tell that you are having the exact same thought patterns. The other person is having the exact same thought patterns. And you can tell we're both going to walk out of this. And in 1 week, we're both doing the same thing all over
Yeah.
again. Like,
Yeah.
that is a scenario in which we have to be honest and just say, like, we have reached an impasse.
Mm-hmm.
And I want better for you. I want better for us. And the only way that we're going to get that, we need somebody else to come in and help
Mm-hmm.
us with this.
Mm-hmm.
And I have had people mediate, like in my marriage. We've had counselors mediate. In my marriage, we've had friends mediate.
Mm-hmm.
I have been a mediator for other
Mm-hmm.
friendships. But I think mediation is wonderful, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's a trusted friend, a pastor, a counselor. And the more that a mediator, their role is not typically, it is not so much to convince one side of something as much as it is to look for common ground. Where are
Mm-hmm.
you all in agreement? And then to offer slightly new language to each
Mm-hmm.
to each of the perspectives that hopefully bring some of that, it makes the bridge shorter.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's so interesting. So I'm going into counseling, and a few of my friends do couples counseling. They're mental health counselors, but they also do couples counseling. And a lot of times people will come in with, all right, this is my chance for them to take my side. They're going to show me that they're going to show this person all the ways that they're wrong. So there's almost this element too of you coming in with the mediation of like humility and understanding of like, hey, I'm probably going to hear some things about myself that I'm not proud of, and vice versa. And it's like, have you found that to be true of just like stepping into mediation situations yourself of like, okay, like, did you go in thinking, all right, this person's gonna see that I'm right because this third party, or did you kind of come in like, all right, let's see what happens here. Maybe I'm going to learn some things about myself, or how did you what was your attitude going into those spaces?
No, I went in with the thought these fools are finally going to see why I have been right all along. And, they just need to hear from the second person. And let me say this, there's also a little bit of truth to that. In particular, I think not from my perspective, but like I can't count the number of times that my wife has said to me, sometimes you just need to hear it from somebody else. And there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
There's some truth to that. Sometimes it is
Yeah.
like, whatever, your friend says it, your boyfriend, girlfriend says it, your spouse says
Mm-hmm.
it, and you're just like, that's just them being them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, they have a lot of wisdom in what they're saying, but we write it off. And then here comes this person that's older and wiser, and then they go,
Yeah.
XYZ, and you're like, oh man, like they were right all along. So I think there are definitely times where I go and like, sort of pompous and like, oh, they're
Mm-hmm.
gonna finally see the truth.
Yeah.
Those don't go as well, because the
Yeah.
truth is like, good mediation, there's always a sense in it's compromise.
Mm,
There's a sense in which um, um, my ego loses, but the
mm,
relationship wins.
yeah.
And that's a painful and hopeful
Mm,
process.
yeah. I heard it said once, I think it might have been on a different podcast. I don't remember, but this idea of like it was talking about in the context of a marriage. Like if I win, then we lose.
Yes.
It's this whole idea of like we need to win together. So like
Yep.
working through that, I think that was a powerful statement I heard one time.
Yes.
So this is I kind of want to wrap up with this question here of how does God get the glory from us handling conflict in a healthy way and resolving conflict or like working through these hard spaces? How does God get glory through that?
Yeah, I think in a few different ways. I think that when we walk in the life and the lifestyle of Jesus,
Mm,
and we approach conflict the way that he does, at some point, some people will be utterly confused by it.
Mm,
and it will open up something in their heart to go, how is this possible?
mm,
And I think of like horrible situations in which, family members are murdered, or children are murdered, and the family goes onto the news and says, like, we
wow.
forgive the person that committed it. That's so confounding to us as people. And I think at a certain level, like when we step into conflict and we do it not to win, but we do it really from a place of love.
Mm-hmm.
That um, at some point, I think that it causes the world to become confused, to begin to ask deeper questions. And now here's this open doorway where
Yeah.
people were able to go, God must be real because this is not possible apart from the work of God.
Yeah.
Um, and I
Yeah.
think that's so different than how we typically approach it. Typically, we
Mm-hmm.
just kind of go out of our defaults.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just being me, just doing my
Mm-hmm.
thing. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that sure, God can show up in those moments. I mean, I'm not saying no, but I do think there's something extra special when we're really attuned with the Lord and we're stepping in going, Jesus, I really want to embody the way that you would handle this right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I also, let me say this too. I also think there's something to be said for like when we don't handle it well.
Mm,
I think there's also something confounding when we don't handle it well. And we're literally like my wife works in the public school system. She's one of very few Christians in her department, and
mm-hmm.
she's had some scenarios come up and she's not handled them well, and she's gone back to those coworkers and she said, hey, yesterday the way that I behaved was not okay and I shouldn't have treated you that way and I'm sorry, will you forgive me? And
Yeah.
she says, utter confusion, like
Mm-hmm.
like like
Yeah.
I do, that is so foreign. So I think just as much as living in righteousness
Mm-hmm.
shows the world something great, I also
Mm-hmm.
think living in grace and humility also
Mm-hmm.
shows the world. I think both of those are a reflection of the presence of Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and hopefully allow the world to ask questions.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that point when Jesus is calling us to something that we can't do in our own strength. When we end up doing it through his power, that like he's getting that glory because there's no way that us and our human frailty and selfishness and pride could have been able to forgive or to own up to our stuff. So yeah, I think that's a really powerful way to end this conversation. Yeah, go ahead,
Can I
Jesse.
have one more thing? I have just
Yes,
one more
please.
final thing.
Please.
Okay.
Yes.
So maybe 5 years ago, my wife and I came across this thing called the 90-10 rule. And
Okay.
the 90-10 rule is essentially this. Some scenario happens. So let's say, Brenda, like you're with your roommates
Mhm.
and something takes place between, and you find one of two things. Either you dramatically overreact, you're like way angrier than what
Mhm.
is necessary,
Mhm.
or the opposite. You should be mad and you're shutting down.
Hmm.
Um, in that scenario, the 90-10 rule would be this: 10% of what you are feeling has to do, let me say that, sorry. 10% has to do with the scenario at hand,
Hmm.
all the details.
Yeah.
So you were late, you didn't do the dishes, you were
Mhm.
late on rent, you didn't pick up the
Mhm.
kids, like whatever it is.
Mhm.
90% of what you're feeling is actually coming from unhealed wounds in your past.
Wow.
So anytime you find yourself overreacting or underreacting, don't pay as much attention to the 10% because that's really not what's happening. Pay attention to the 90%. My wife
Yeah.
and I use this phrase when one of us finds ourselves behaving in more extreme ways. We'll say, what's the 90%? And it's
Mm.
our way to go, hey, can we kind of cut the crap here where we're talking, we're nitpicking, we're going back and forth. Those are irrelevant. That's not really
Mhm.
what's happening here.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the real stuff, and that's the 90%. And that's
Yeah.
where it's
Yeah.
like, okay, we're in the deep end now. This is the good stuff.
Man, yeah, I heard it said that's really good to think about because I heard it said like change happens when you do the deep work over a long period of time in community. And it was like
Yes.
these, I think I heard it from a pastor. But yeah, it's like yeah, going into that deep stuff so that way the next time conflict comes, maybe you handle it a little bit better or you're just more aware of like the past issues that are shaping your responses. So that's really good to think about. And that's also a great note to end this podcast on. Jesse, it's been an honor and a pleasure to talk with you about this topic that I've been thinking about for a minute. Could you sort of explain if anyone's interested in signing up for Love Thy Neighborhood, how do they get a hold of you? How do they sign
Yeah.
up for this program? Where do they find your podcast?
Yeah, great. Okay, so a few different things you can do. So if you want to check out our podcast, just go to whatever podcast app you are listening to this podcast in right now and look for Love Thy Neighborhood. And what you'll see is Love Thy Neighborhood comes up, as well as Love Thy Neighborhood presents the Enneacast. So you can find both of our shows that way. The other thing is, if you're wanting to do something meaningful with your life, let me say this. Right now in your 20s, you have a window of opportunity that you'll never have again. The responsibilities and burdens of life only increase from here. I just want to encourage, give a year of your life away to somebody that's in need.
Wow.
It's going to shape your values. It's going to impact who you marry, the kind of job that you get, the place you live, the community that you build, by giving away that year of your life. And so if you want to give that year to us, go to lovethyneighborhood.org, and you can learn all about our LTN Institute, which is a year-long program, or our LTN Intensive, which is a summer program. And then the final thing is, if you want to explore more about why am I wired the way that I'm wired, you can also go to our website and sign up for one of our workshops or buy a workbook. Or I've got a book coming out in January. You can pre-order on Amazon, called How We Relate: Understanding God, Yourself, and Others Through the Enneagram.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Jesse. And I'll put all the links in the description too, so you guys should have easy access to all the amazing things that Jesse just shared. Thank you guys so much for listening to another episode of Soul Things and joining me on this journey of just navigating life through your 20s. And remember that even in the hard spaces, His grace abounds. See you next week.